Welcome back everyone. Today I'm going to be following a recipe for birria tacos that I found on YouTube, so stay tuned. First you're going to want to start by washing your beef and then cutting it into smaller pieces so that it will cook faster. The cut of meat I have here is called eye round and it's about 2.5 pounds. There isn't a specific size to cut the meat into, I just cut them into 4 pieces so it's not a big piece. Next I'm moving on to the beef shank, which I already pre-washed and I'm also cutting into smaller pieces. So the recipe I was following on YouTube didn't quite ask for beef shanks, but I saw several recipes online that did use beef shank, so I just used both beef shank and eye round. I do want to note that while I did use 2.5 pounds of eye round meat, I recommend maybe 3 to 3.5 if you want more meat for your tacos, because I ended up having way more consommé than I did have meat. Next I'm gonna prep and peel my onion. The recipe originally called for a white onion, but I only had a yellow onion, so that's what I used. So basically to prep the onion, I just cut off the ends and then I peeled the outside shell off, and I kept it whole because you're just gonna throw it in to boil with your meat. If you notice here, my onion is slightly ugly and I just cut off the ugly parts and used it. But if you happen to have a pretty onion, you don't have to cut anything off of it, just leave it whole. Now you're going to want to get one of the biggest pots you have. Maybe not the biggest, but you want a decent sized pot to put all the meat inside. This is also where you're going to place your onion and a few bay leaves, along with some garlic. Next we're going to top it off with some kosher salt. When I was watching the recipe video on YouTube, the girl literally just threw handfuls of salt inside, and I don't know how much she put. I just try to replicate what she did. Next we're going to add water to the pot, and you're just going to want enough water to cover the meat. Depending on your pot size, the water might be different, but don't worry if you add too much water because it's going to cook down later anyways. Next you're going to want to turn your stove on high heat and just cook it until it boils. While the mixture is boiling, we're going to go on to the next step and de-seed all of the chili peppers. So here I have 3 different types of chili peppers, which are the guajillo pepper, ancho, and pasilla. The recipe I was following also said to include arbol chilies, but I didn't have those, so I just did the recipe without them. Some of these chili peppers can be kind of tedious to de-seed, so you can just break them in half or do whatever you want to de-seed them. Just try to get all the seeds out. If you happen to be super sensitive to chilies, make sure you wear gloves when you're doing this. And also, don't forget, try not to touch your face. So when I was de-seeding this chili right here, I just cut the stem and then I shook all the seeds out. But later I discovered that not all the chilies were as easy to de-seed. So we're just going to continue to de-seed all the peppers, and you can de-seed them in any way you want. Some of them I just cut them in half and then I shook all the seeds out. You just want to make sure you get all the seeds out. So once you de-seeded all your chilies, you're going to want to place them in a pot, and then you're going to want to wash them a few times and then cover the pot with water. Alright, now we're going to take a quick intermission from the chilies to check on the pot that we had on the stove. So what you see here is scum and impurities that came from the meat after boiling it, and what you're going to want to do is spoon it all out. You can use anything you want to scoop it out, but I personally like this super fine strainer because it gets all of it out. I also want to note that while you're scooping the scum out, make sure you don't accidentally scoop the bay leaves and throw them out because you need them in there. Later on, you're going to want to keep watching your soup to make sure that more impurities don't form, and if they do, just keep scooping them out. Just like this. So after I got out all the impurities, I added some beef stock in. The recipe originally didn't ask for beef stock, but I bought some and I just wanted to add it in for the extra beef flavor. The beef stock is probably going to bring the temperature of your soup down, so you're just going to cook it until it starts to simmer and boil once again. Alright, so now we're just going to let the soup do its thing and let the meat become nice and tender, and check on it every so often to skim off any impurities that form at the top. Now we're gonna move back on to the chilies. You're gonna wanna put the pot on the stove and cook it on high heat until the chilies are nice and soft. So while you're cooking the chilies, you're gonna wanna make sure all the peppers are submerged so that they can all cook evenly, and give them a good stir once in a while too. So now we're just gonna continue to cook them for about 8 to 10 minutes until they're super soft, and then you're gonna wanna set it aside to cool down. So like I mentioned earlier, you're going to want to keep checking on your meat pretty often, and while the peppers are cooking, this is the perfect time to do so. If there are any impurities on top, you just want to skim it off. If you find that the water in the pot is evaporating too fast, you can add a little bit more water, or you can turn the heat a little low. While the peppers are cooling and the soup is still cooking, we're going to work on the chili mixture now. So for the chili mixture, we're going to start with peeling the ginger. In the video, the girl measured the piece of ginger with 2 of her fingers. So I guess you want about 1-inch piece of ginger. I'm pretty sure my fingers are different than hers, so I basically just eyeballed it. So to peel the ginger, I just used the back of the knife, but you can also use a spoon to do it. You don't really need to use the sharp edge, as the skin of a ginger peels pretty easily. So just peel the ginger, and then we're just going to leave it whole because it's going to just get thrown into the blender. So next up, I'm just toasting up some sesame seeds because I didn't have toasted sesame seeds. So if you have toasted sesame seeds, you can totally skip this part. So if you don't have toasted sesame seeds, just put the sesame seeds into a pan on high heat and just keep shaking it and keeping an eye on it because it burns really fast. Once it becomes a nice golden brown, the seeds are nice and toasted, and you're basically done. So by now, we're basically done preparing all the ingredients for the chili sauce, so we're going to start by putting the chilled chilies into the blender. When I say chilled chilies, I don't mean that they're going to be nice and cold. They're still going to be pretty warm, they're just not going to be boiling hot. Next, we're going to dump in the sesame seeds that we toasted into the blender as well. I know at first this recipe might be intimidating, but it's really not, because at this point we're just throwing everything into the blender and blending it, and then we're just going to pour it into the pot. So next we're going to add in the ginger that we already peeled, the cinnamon, the black peppercorn, the cloves, the thyme, the oregano, the cumin, the bay leaves, and the garlic cloves. Then we're just going to add in some beef stock so that it can blend easily. So depending on the type of blender you have, you might have to blend it just a little bit longer than I did to get a nice and smooth chili sauce. If you need to, make sure you turn the blender off and stir the contents inside so that everything is nice and blended. After about 1.5 hours to 2 hours, you're going to want to take the onion and the bay leaves out. In the recipe video, they also said to take the garlic out, but I personally love garlic, so I just left it in there. Next, with the strainer, you're going to want to strain some of the chili sauce into the soup a little bit at a time. So I know in this video I use a super fine strainer to strain the chili sauce in, however I don't recommend it because it took so long for me to strain the sauce into the soup. So I highly recommend you use a strainer with just slightly bigger holes than this one, that way the sauce could just pass right through. If you don't want to strain your chili sauce now, you could always just dump the whole thing in, however later you would have to strain the whole consommé, which is not as fun. So when I was straining, I would sometimes dip the strainer into the soup, that way it was a little more liquidy so that I could strain it more easier. So just continue to strain until you can get all the chili sauce into the soup. So next, if you have just a little bit of chili sauce left stuck at the bottom of the blender, just pour some beef stock in, and then we're going to blend it right up, and then we're going to strain it back into the soup. So once you finally strained all the chili sauce into the soup, just give it a good stir and mix all the chili and the soup together. I also forgot to add vinegar into the chili sauce, so I just poured it in now, and I don't think it made a big difference when I did it because it came out amazing still. So once your beef is nice and tender, you're going to want to take it out so that it can cool for a bit before we shred it up. My stove heat and your stove heat might be different, so if yours isn't quite tender yet, just continue to cook it for just a little bit longer. I didn't quite show it in the video, but at this point you're also going to want to scoop out 4 cups of the soup broth before we turn it into a consommé. So while the meat is cooling, we're just going to prepare the tomatoes for the consommé. You just want to wash them and then score them slightly at the tip and then cook them until they start to peel slightly. Once the skin starts to peel away and they turn slightly orange, they're basically cooked and you want to strain the water. So next, in the same blender, just throw in the tomatoes and blend it until it's nice and smooth. Next, to create the consommé, we're going to strain the pureed tomatoes into the stock. So I don't really understand how consommés work or why they add the tomato into the soup to create the consommé. I was just following the directions and it came out amazing, so just do it. After you strain all the tomato puree in, just give it a nice good mix so everything is nice and blended. After you give it a nice good mix, just continue to cook it so that it can heat right back up to a simmer. So once the meat has cooled down, you're just going to want to cut it or shred it into small pieces. In the video I was watching, the girl used her hand to shred the meat, and as you can see in this video, the meat is still pretty hot and my hands were basically burning. I could not do the same as she did. Honestly, I tried to troop it out for as long as I could to shred the meat with my hands, but it started to get way too hot, so I just had to switch to gloves, which was way more tolerable and manageable. So as you can see here, the meat basically falls apart and it's really easy to rip apart and shred. So if your meat hasn't cooked long enough, you're just going to want to put it back in and cook it longer until you can break it up with your hand. If you don't want to break it up with your hand, you can also use a knife to cut it up, but I think it's way better when you do shred it with your hand because the texture is much better. So you're going to want to just continue shredding the meat until everything is shredded and broken up into smaller pieces. Then we're going to dump it back all into the pot. So once you put all the meat back into the soup, you're going to want to give it a nice good stir so that the meat can absorb all the flavors. Once it cooks for just a little bit, you're going to want to give it a taste and see whether or not it needed more salt. And it did for me, so I added just a little bit more salt. At this point, we're basically done. However, if you can chill it overnight and then cook it the next day, it will be even better. Another note I want to mention is that if your consommé seems too thick, you're going to want to add water to thin it out and then adjust the salt to taste. Just be careful not to add too much water or it might become bland. When you're ready to prepare your tacos, you're just going to want to dip the tacos into the reserved soup stock that we saved before we turned it into a consommé, and then you're going to want to put it on a pan. My tortillas were pretty fragile, so some of them broke, so I recommend using a plate to dip it. If you have a pancake griddle just like this, I highly recommend it because you can control the temperature way better than on the stove. So we're just placing little bits of meat into each taco. So after you put the meat on, you can turn the heat up a little bit if you do not want to add cheese. However, if you do want to add cheese, I would add the cheese first and then turn the heat up. That way your taco shell doesn't burn and your cheese gets nice and melted after. So in the video, they highly recommend you use Oaxaca cheese, but I couldn't find it, so I just used mozzarella cheese and it worked just as well. You're just going to want to continue to cook until the base gets nice and toasted. Then you're going to want to flip them all in half, similar to like a quesadilla, so that it gets nice and crispy and the cheese is nice and melted. Once the cheese is melted, we're just going to top it off with a mixture of cilantro and fresh sliced onions. I also did a batch where I put the cheese before the meat to see if it would melt better, but you can do whichever way you want. I'm sure it'll come out the same. And just like that, once they're nice and crispy, we're done and the Quesa Birria tacos are ready to eat. Now the cheese is totally optional and not many would like to add it in, but I love cheese and look at how cheesy this is. Don't forget to serve the consommé on the side and dip it right in because it is the best part. This recipe absolutely came out even better than I expected and it tasted better the next day. So if you give the recipe a try, let me know and I'll see you next time.